January 1941. Moscow, the Kremlin. General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stood in an anteroom outside Stalin's office, waiting. Waiting in Stalin's anteroom was never comfortable. Waiting in Stalin's anteroom was a reminder that your life could change in seconds, that you could enter as a general and exit as nothing, that the words you spoke in the next few minutes could determine whether you lived or died. Zhukov was 56 years old. He had survived the Great Purge, the systematic execution of the Soviet military's officer corps in 1937 and 1938. Zhukov had survived when more than half of the Soviet military's high command had been murdered. Thousands of officers had been shot. Thousands more had been imprisoned in Soviet camps. The entire military hierarchy had been decapitated, and Zhukov had survived. This fact alone, that Zhukov had lived when almost everyone of equivalent rank had died, was remarkable. Zhukov had survived because he was good. Zhukov understood warfare. Zhukov had combat experience. Zhukov had fought in the Far East in 1939 against Japanese forces in Mongolia. Zhukov had won that conflict decisively. Zhukov had proven to Stalin that he was not a useless aristocrat or a bourgeois military careerist. Zhukov had proven that he understood modern warfare, and most importantly, Zhukov had proven that he was loyal to the Soviet system, even though the Soviet system had murdered his colleagues. A door opened. An aide gestured. Zhukov entered Stalin's office. Stalin sat behind his desk. Stalin was smaller than people expected. Stalin seemed almost ordinary, a man with a mustache, thinning hair, ordinary features. But Stalin's presence was overwhelming. Stalin was the man who had killed millions. Stalin was the man who had transformed the Soviet Union into an industrial power. Stalin was the man who had murdered half the military and built the other half into his image. Stalin gestured to a chair. Zhukov sat. Stalin spoke. General Zhukov, I have been reviewing the military situation. Germany is strengthening. Germany is arming. Germany is preparing for something. What is your assessment of German military capability? Zhukov chose his words carefully. Comrade Stalin, Germany possesses a modern military. Germany has professional officer corps. Germany has industrial production. But the German military is not invulnerable. Soviet military power is growing. Soviet industrial production is expanding. In time, the Soviet Union will be stronger than Germany. Stalin studied Zhukov's face. How much time, General? Years, Comrade Stalin. Perhaps 5 or 10 years. Stalin leaned back. Then we do not have time to wait. Germany will move before then. I have intelligence indicating that Germany is preparing to attack the Soviet Union, perhaps this year. Perhaps next year, but Germany will attack. Zhukov knew this was true. Soviet intelligence had been reporting German military movements. German armies were gathering near the Soviet border. German strategic planning seemed oriented toward the east, toward the Soviet Union. Stalin continued. When Germany attacks, we must be prepared to move first. We must launch a preemptive offensive. We must destroy the German military before it can destroy us. This was where the danger began. Zhukov understood what Stalin was saying. Stalin wanted to launch an offensive against Germany. Stalin wanted to anticipate German aggression by attacking first. Zhukov knew this would be a catastrophic mistake. The Soviet army was not ready for offensive operations. The Soviet officer corps was still recovering from the purges. Soviet logistics were inadequate. Soviet training was incomplete. Soviet mechanization was progressing but still incomplete. Soviet coordination between air and ground forces was underdeveloped. The Soviet military was organized and growing stronger, but it was not ready for a massive offensive against the German Wehrmacht. But Zhukov also knew that disagreeing with Stalin was dangerous. Stalin had executed generals before. Stalin had imprisoned generals before. Stalin had made it clear that he tolerated no disagreement about military strategy. And yet, Zhukov was chief of the general staff. It was Zhukov's responsibility to provide accurate military assessment. It was Zhukov's responsibility to advise Stalin about what the Soviet military could and could not accomplish. Zhukov made a decision in that moment, a decision that would either save his life or end it. "Comrade Stalin," Zhukov said carefully, "an offensive operation against Germany would require complete preparation. The Soviet army must be ready. The logistics must be arranged. The transportation must be available. The reserves must be positioned. To launch an offensive before these preparations are complete would be—" Zhukov paused, choosing the word, "premature." Stalin's expression changed. "Are you saying the Soviet military is not ready to defeat Germany?" "I am saying," Zhukov replied, "that defeating Germany requires proper preparation. If Germany attacks us before this preparation is complete, the Soviet military must be ready to defend. A defensive position, properly prepared, can withstand German aggression. Then, when German strength has been exhausted, the Soviet military can counterattack." Stalin stared at Zhukov for a long moment. In that moment, Zhukov understood that he might have made a terrible mistake. Stalin tolerated no disagreement. And Zhukov had disagreed, not with words, but with implications clear enough that Stalin would understand. Then Stalin spoke. "General Zhukov, you have survived the purges when better men than you were executed. Why do you think that is?" "I do not know, Comrade Stalin," Zhukov replied carefully. "It is because you are useful," Stalin said. "You understand warfare. You won against the Japanese in the Far East. You bring results, not theories. But I will tell you something, General. If you are wrong about this, if I follow your advice and Germany defeats us, then your usefulness will end. And when your usefulness ends, your life will end. Do you understand?" "Yes, Comrade Stalin," Zhukov said. "I understand." "But if you are right," Stalin continued, "if Germany attacks us and the Soviet military is positioned to defend, then you will be valuable beyond measure. You will be the man who saved the Soviet Union from German invasion." Stalin leaned forward. "So here is what will happen. You will prepare the Soviet military for both offensive and defensive operations. You will prepare positions that appear to be preparation for offense, but that are actually strong defensive positions. You will do this without telling me what you are doing, so that I can tell others that the Soviet military is preparing for offense. And if Germany attacks, when Germany attacks, you will position the Soviet military to defeat them. And if Germany does not attack, and I decide to attack Germany instead, then the Soviet military will attack. Do you understand what I am asking?" "Yes, Comrade Stalin," Zhukov replied. He understood. Stalin was asking Zhukov to deceive him. Stalin was asking Zhukov to prepare defenses while appearing to prepare offenses. Stalin was giving Zhukov permission, implicit, unspoken permission, to be right about what was going to happen. "Then go," Stalin said. "Prepare the military. And Zhukov, if you fail in this responsibility, I will remember this conversation when they execute you." Zhukov left Stalin's office knowing that he had stepped onto a knife's edge. He had disagreed with Stalin and survived. But he had also placed himself in a position where his entire future depended on events he could not control. If Germany did not invade, if Stalin decided to attack Germany first, then Zhukov's defensive preparations would be seen as insubordination. If Germany did invade, and the Soviet military was not ready, then Zhukov's defensive strategy would be seen as failure. Zhukov had placed his life on the judgment of events. But Zhukov also knew something that Stalin did not fully understand. Zhukov knew that Germany would attack. Zhukov's intelligence had been clear. Germany was preparing an invasion. The only question was when. Zhukov had made a gamble that the right moment to speak truth to Stalin was before the invasion, not after. Zhukov had gambled that his military competence would matter more than his disagreement with Stalin's strategy. Only history would determine if Zhukov was right. February 1941. Zhukov stood in the operations room of the Soviet General Staff headquarters. Maps covered the walls. Red lines indicated Soviet positions. Blue lines indicated German positions. The blue lines were advancing eastward, closer to the Soviet border with each passing week. Zhukov studied the German deployments. The pattern was unmistakable. Germany was preparing for invasion. The concentration of forces was too precise, too systematic to indicate anything else. German panzer divisions were being staged. German air bases were being established. German logistics were being positioned. The invasion was not a question of if, but when. Zhukov began his deception. He ordered Soviet forces to prepare defensive positions, but he couched these orders in language that suggested offensive preparation. He ordered the construction of fortified lines that would be effective in defense, but that could be described as staging areas for offensive operations. He ordered the training of Soviet units in defensive tactics, but disguised this as mobile warfare training. Every order was designed to accomplish two things simultaneously: prepare the Soviet military for the defense it would need, while appearing to prepare for the offense that Stalin demanded. A general named Rokossovsky approached Zhukov. Rokossovsky commanded a front, a large military formation equivalent to an American army group. Rokossovsky was nervous. "General Zhukov, the orders you are sending me, they are contradictory. You order me to prepare defensive positions, but you describe them as offensive staging areas. You order me to train my forces in defense, but you call it mobile warfare training. What am I actually supposed to be preparing for?" Zhukov looked at Rokossovsky carefully. This was the moment where everything could unravel. If Rokossovsky reported these contradictions to Stalin, if Stalin learned that Zhukov was preparing for defense rather than offense, Zhukov would be arrested. "General Rokossovsky," Zhukov said quietly, "you are preparing for what is actually going to happen. The words I use in official reports are different from the reality of what you are preparing. When Germany attacks, and Germany will attack, your forces will be positioned to defend. You will be ready. But this must remain between us. If Stalin learns that I am preparing defenses rather than offensives, we will both be executed." Rokossovsky understood. Like most Soviet officers of that era, Rokossovsky had learned to operate in a system where official orders often contradicted reality. Rokossovsky nodded. "I will prepare my forces to defend, General. I understand." By March 1941, German intelligence was reporting that Soviet military was preparing for offensive operations. German High Command interpreted Soviet preparations as preparation for a preemptive Soviet strike. This belief actually worked in Zhukov's favor. The Germans began discussing the possibility of launching their invasion earlier to prevent Soviet offense. But German preparations were not yet complete. So while German commanders debated, German forces continued to build toward the Soviet border. Zhukov submitted reports to Stalin claiming that Soviet preparations for offensive operations were progressing. But simultaneously, Zhukov was creating defensive positions. Zhukov was positioning reserve forces in locations where they could respond to German invasion. Zhukov was establishing command structures that were organized for defense. Zhukov was creating what would later be called the deep battle doctrine, a defensive system that could absorb German invasion and then counterattack. Stalin grew impatient. Stalin wanted the offensive to begin. Stalin wanted to attack Germany before Germany could attack the Soviet Union, but Zhukov continued to delay. Zhukov reported that preparations were not yet complete. Zhukov said that attacking prematurely would be disaster. Zhukov maintained that the Soviet military was better positioned to defend than to attack. By May 1941, Stalin had grown tired of Zhukov's caution. Stalin began to believe that Zhukov was deliberately delaying offensive preparations out of cowardice or lack of confidence in Soviet military strength. Stalin began to doubt Zhukov. But then, in mid-May, Zhukov received confirmation of what he had suspected. German invasion would begin within weeks. German forces had reached a level of readiness that made invasion inevitable. The intelligence was clear. Germany would attack in late May or early June. Zhukov requested an urgent meeting with Stalin. When Zhukov entered Stalin's office this time, Stalin was angry.
"General Zhukov, your delays have wasted months. I have decided that we will launch our own offensive. Soviet forces will attack Germany before Germany can attack us. This will demonstrate Soviet superiority." Zhukov made his final gamble. "Comrade Stalin, Germany will attack us within 3 weeks. Our intelligence is certain. If we attack now, we will be caught mid-operation when German forces attack. We will be defeated. But if we wait, if we maintain our defensive positions, when Germany attacks, we will be ready." Stalin's face darkened. "You dare to contradict me again, General? You dare to refuse my orders?" "I am not refusing, Comrade Stalin. I am reporting military reality. If we attack now, we lose. If we defend, we can survive and then counterattack." Stalin stared at Zhukov. In that moment, Zhukov fully expected to be arrested. Zhukov fully expected execution. Then Stalin said something that would change everything. "If you are wrong, General Zhukov, you will be executed as a traitor. But if you are right, if Germany does attack within 3 weeks, then your defensive preparations will be essential. So I will wait. I will see if you are right." Stalin was betting on Zhukov, not out of friendship or confidence, but out of calculation. Stalin recognized that if Zhukov was right about the invasion, then Zhukov's defensive preparations might save the Soviet Union. And if Zhukov was wrong, Stalin could always execute him later. On June 20th, German invasion forces began final movement toward the Soviet border. The invasion would begin the next day. Zhukov had been right. He had read the strategic situation correctly. He had understood that Germany would attack when Soviet military would be most vulnerable. Before Soviet preparations were complete, but after German preparations were complete. Zhukov had placed his life on this judgment, and his judgment had been proven correct. June 22, 1941, 4 in the morning, German artillery began bombardment of Soviet positions. German aircraft launched attacks on Soviet airfields. German panzer divisions crossed into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The German Wehrmacht was invading the Soviet Union with over 3 million soldiers, concentrated in 3 massive army groups, supported by the largest air force ever assembled. Zhukov was already at the General Staff headquarters when the first reports arrived. Zhukov had been awake all night, expecting this. Zhukov had positioned himself where he could respond immediately. Within minutes, Zhukov was coordinating the Soviet response. Soviet forces that had been positioned for defense activated their defensive plans. Soviet reserves that had been staged in rear areas began moving toward threatened sectors. Soviet air units that had survived the initial German onslaught began launching counterattacks. The first 24 hours of the invasion were chaotic. German forces achieved massive initial success. Soviet forces were pushed back. Soviet lines were broken in multiple sectors.
But unlike the German invasions of Poland and France, where defending forces collapsed within days, Soviet forces began to organize resistance. The defensive positions that Zhukov had prepared, disguised under language of offensive staging areas, proved effective. Soviet units that had trained for defense in ways disguised as mobile warfare training now performed that defense. Stalin was in shock. Stalin had not believed the invasion would come. Stalin had convinced himself that Germany would negotiate, would wait, would give the Soviet Union more time to prepare. But invasion had come anyway, and now Stalin was in a state of semi-paralysis. Stalin did not appear in public for days. Stalin did not issue coherent orders for days. The Soviet military was suddenly operating without clear political direction. In this vacuum, Zhukov became the central figure organizing Soviet defense. Zhukov traveled between fronts. Zhukov coordinated reserves. Zhukov made tactical decisions about where Soviet forces should be positioned. Zhukov analyzed German movements and predicted where German attacks would come next. Zhukov did what had to be done to prevent complete Soviet collapse in the first days of the invasion. After 3 days of invasion, Stalin finally appeared and asked Zhukov a simple question. Can we win this war? Zhukov, understanding that his life depended on his answer, also understood that honesty was required. Comrade Stalin, yes, we can win, but the war will be long. The Germans are strong. They have modern equipment. They have experienced soldiers. But they do not have the resources we have. The Soviet Union is vast. The Soviet people are numerous. The Soviet Union can produce weapons. This war will be determined not by who wins the first battles, but by who survives the longest. We will lose many battles, but if we do not collapse, if we continue to fight, eventually the Germans will exhaust themselves, and then we will counterattack. Stalin accepted this analysis. Stalin understood that he had been wrong about the offensive, but he also understood that Zhukov had been right about defense. Stalin appointed Zhukov Deputy Supreme Commander. Zhukov was now responsible for organizing the entire Soviet military response to German invasion. But Zhukov's authority, while vast in military matters, remained constrained by political reality. Zhukov could make military decisions, but he could not directly challenge Stalin's political authority. When Stalin ordered suicidal counterattacks that military logic suggested would fail, Zhukov had to find ways to delay or modify those orders while appearing to obey. When Stalin demanded that Soviet forces hold positions that could not be held, Zhukov had to find ways to execute strategic retreats while appearing to follow Stalin's no-retreat orders. It was a constant negotiation between military reality and political authority. Zhukov survived this negotiation by being indispensable. Every time Zhukov's military judgment proved correct, when predictions about German movements came true, when defensive positions held when they should have collapsed, Zhukov's authority increased. Zhukov became the one person Stalin would listen to about military matters, because Zhukov was consistently right. By the end of 1941, though, German forces had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, had surrounded Soviet armies, had destroyed Soviet industry in Western regions. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. The German invasion had not achieved its objective of destroying Soviet military power in a single campaign. The war had become the long war that Zhukov had predicted, and in that long war, Soviet industrial capacity, Soviet manpower, and Soviet strategic planning, all orchestrated by Zhukov, would eventually overcome German military power. Zhukov had entered 1941 as a general who had disagreed with Stalin and survived. He emerged from 1941 as the architect of Soviet survival. He emerged as the one man Stalin would genuinely listen to about matters of war. Zhukov had gambled that his military competence would matter more than his disagreement with Stalin's strategy, and history had proven him right. 1942. The war had become the grinding, brutal conflict Zhukov had predicted. German forces had penetrated deep into Soviet territory. German armies surrounded Soviet forces at Stalingrad. Soviet counteroffensive possibilities seemed limited, but Zhukov saw opportunity where others saw only disaster. Zhukov developed a plan called Operation Uranus, a massive Soviet counteroffensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The plan was aggressive, complex, and brilliant. It required perfect coordination between multiple Soviet fronts. It required accumulation of massive reserves in secret. It required absolute confidence in Soviet ability to execute complex operations. Stalin initially rejected the plan. Stalin wanted Soviet forces to simply defend Stalingrad, to hold the city at all costs. Zhukov pushed back. Zhukov explained that defense would mean annihilation. Zhukov explained that only counteroffensive could save Soviet forces. Zhukov explained that the German Sixth Army was vulnerable because German strategic reserves were depleted. For the first time in the war, Stalin listened to Zhukov's disagreement and accepted it. Stalin authorized Operation Uranus. Zhukov implemented it. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive. German forces were encircled. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was trapped. Within weeks, the Sixth Army had surrendered or been destroyed. The victory at Stalingrad was transformative. Soviet morale soared. German morale collapsed. The world understood that Soviet forces could defeat German forces in battle. Zhukov, the general who had dissented from Stalin and been proven right, became the symbol of Soviet military competence. But Zhukov understood something else. The victory at Stalingrad had been achieved despite Stalin's preferences, not because of them. Zhukov had had to argue with Stalin, had had to convince Stalin, had had to ultimately override Stalin's initial judgment about strategy. And Stalin had allowed it because Zhukov had proven his judgment superior to Stalin's. This created a new dynamic. Stalin began to trust Zhukov's military judgment more completely. But Stalin also began to fear Zhukov's influence. Stalin had always eliminated rivals. Stalin had always purged potential threats to his authority, and Zhukov, now the most famous general in the Soviet Union, with the ear of the supreme leader, was beginning to look like a potential threat. In 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, Zhukov's planning proved crucial again. Zhukov predicted German strategy. Zhukov positioned Soviet reserves to counter German attacks. Zhukov coordinated a defense so effective that the massive German offensive failed. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. Soviet forces defeated German forces decisively. Zhukov's authority now exceeded that of any military officer in Soviet history. Zhukov coordinated Soviet operations across all fronts. Zhukov made recommendations that Stalin generally accepted. Zhukov had transcended the normal subordination of military to political authority. Zhukov had become something more, the indispensable military genius without whom Soviet victory seemed impossible. But this power had a cost. The more powerful Zhukov became, the more threatened Stalin felt. Stalin began to worry that Zhukov might become a political threat after the war. Stalin began to whisper about the dangers of military power overwhelming political authority. Stalin began to suggest, carefully, that perhaps Zhukov's military judgment was becoming infected with political ambition. By 1945, as Germany was being defeated, as Soviet forces were advancing into Eastern Europe, as victory became certain, Stalin's attitude toward Zhukov began to change. Stalin had needed Zhukov during the war, but Stalin did not need Zhukov during the peace. And as the war ended, Stalin began to move against him. In June 1945, Zhukov was summoned to Moscow. Stalin, with barely concealed hostility, told Zhukov that he was being reassigned to a minor military command far from Moscow. Zhukov's power was being stripped away. Zhukov's authority was being eliminated. Zhukov was being removed from the seat of power. Zhukov accepted this reassignment without protest. Zhukov understood that he could not survive as a rival to Stalin. Zhukov understood that military power, however great during wartime, meant nothing against political power in peacetime. Zhukov accepted exile rather than fight Stalin directly. But Zhukov's sacrifice was not forgotten. Soviet officers who had served with Zhukov, who had survived the war because of Zhukov's brilliance, remembered. The Soviet people understood that Zhukov had been instrumental in victory. Even though Stalin had removed Zhukov from power, even though Zhukov was living in obscurity, his reputation remained intact. Zhukov had gambled on his military competence being more valuable than his political loyalty, and in war, he had been proven right. In peace, political loyalty mattered more. But the historical record would remember both: the general who had disagreed with the dictator and saved his country, and the system that would not tolerate even its greatest heroes if they became too powerful. 1946. Stalin was dead. Nikita Khrushchev had consolidated power. Khrushchev, needing to consolidate his authority, began to remove potential rivals from positions of power. Zhukov, who had been living in relative obscurity in a minor military command, was suddenly recalled to Moscow. Khrushchev appointed him commander of Soviet ground forces. For several years, Zhukov was useful again. Zhukov helped Khrushchev consolidate power. When military conspirators attempted to overthrow Khrushchev in 1957, Zhukov helped suppress the coup. Zhukov's loyalty was repaid with appointment as Soviet defense minister. Zhukov had recovered much of the power and prestige that Stalin had stripped from him. But history was repeating itself. Khrushchev, like Stalin, began to fear the general who was too powerful, too popular, too influential. Khrushchev began to worry that Zhukov might use military power to influence political decisions. Khrushchev began to move against Zhukov. In October 1957, Khrushchev removed Zhukov from all positions. Zhukov was accused of promoting his own personality cult. Zhukov was accused of trying to build an independent power base within the military. Zhukov was retired from military service. Zhukov was removed from Moscow. Zhukov was sent to live in a provincial town, watched constantly, isolated from political power. But Zhukov was not executed. Zhukov was not imprisoned. Zhukov survived because he had done something unprecedented in Soviet history. Zhukov had made himself valuable enough that even after his removal from power, killing him would be politically costly. Khrushchev could not execute the man who had saved the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet people would not accept it. Zhukov spent his final years in exile, living quietly, writing his memoirs, reflecting on his career. Zhukov died in 1974. His memoirs, published after his death, provided the historical record of his disagreements with Stalin, his role in Soviet victory, and his understanding of how military power and political authority must balance. The paradox of Zhukov's life was this: he had survived authoritarianism not through political skill, not through flattery, not through complicity with the system's worst aspects. He had survived through competence. He had made himself so valuable that the dictators could not afford to kill him. But he had also understood that this value was temporary. In war, military competence was essential. In peace, political loyalty was more important. Zhukov had accepted his diminishment because he understood this reality. What Zhukov demonstrated was that even in the most oppressive system, there exists a space for individual integrity. Not because the system tolerates it, but because the system sometimes needs it. Zhukov had disagreed with Stalin about military strategy. Zhukov had been willing to risk his life on his judgment, and because his judgment was correct, because his military vision proved superior to Stalin's political intuitions, Zhukov had created a moment where the system was forced to listen. This moment did not change the system. It did not democratize the Soviet Union. It did not create space for widespread disagreement or dissent, but it demonstrated that individual judgment, when supported by competence and conviction, could make a difference even within authoritarianism. It demonstrated that one general, willing to speak truth to power, could influence events that affected millions of lives. The war that Zhukov had predicted, that Stalin had initially rejected his analysis of, that Zhukov had then organized the defense for, ultimately cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives. If Zhukov had not intervened, if Stalin had launched the offensive that Stalin originally desired, the losses might have been even greater. Zhukov's disagreement with Stalin, his willingness to risk his life to advocate for what he believed was militarily sound, potentially saved millions of Soviet lives. This was Zhukov's legacy. Not monuments, not statues, but the historical knowledge that once, in the darkest moment of Soviet history, a general had the courage to say no to the dictator. And the dictator, because he needed that general, had listened. The historical significance of Zhukov extends far beyond the Soviet Union or even the Second World War. Zhukov's story contains a fundamental lesson about power, competence, and the space that exists for individual integrity even within authoritarianism. Military historians studying Zhukov have reached consensus. He was one of the greatest military commanders of the 20th century. Soviet military doctrine was shaped by his innovations. NATO military strategists studied his tactical and operational concepts. American military academies incorporated Zhukov's campaigns into their curriculum. But Zhukov's significance is not merely military. Zhukov's significance is moral. Zhukov demonstrated that an individual could disagree with an authoritarian leader without being destroyed, if that individual possessed knowledge and competence that the system needed. This was not a triumph of the system becoming more humane or democratic. This was a triumph of one man understanding the boundaries of his power and exploiting them. The question historians ask is this: what would have happened if Zhukov had not spoken up in January 1941? If Zhukov had simply agreed with Stalin? If Zhukov had not insisted on defensive preparations? The most likely scenario is that Soviet forces would have launched an offensive against Germany in the spring of 1941. This offensive would have been met by German invasion forces that were already mobilized. Soviet forces, caught mid-operation, would have been shattered. German victory would have been swift and decisive. The Soviet Union might have been defeated. Instead, because Zhukov insisted on his military judgment, because Zhukov was willing to risk his life to advocate for what he believed was correct, Soviet forces were prepared for invasion. When German forces attacked, Soviet defenses held. Soviet forces were able to retreat in organized fashion rather than collapse. Soviet forces were able to eventually counterattack and defeat Germany. The cost of Soviet victory was immense. 27 million Soviet lives were lost. Soviet territory was devastated. Soviet economy was destroyed. But the alternative, German victory, might have meant total Soviet annihilation. Zhukov's disagreement with Stalin, his insistence on military realism, possibly prevented that outcome. Military theorists have identified what they call the Zhukov principle, the idea that, in extreme circumstances, when the state faces existential threat, the system sometimes needs to listen to voices of technical expertise, even when those voices contradict political authority. The Zhukov principle is not about democracy or human rights. It is about survival. When institutions face destruction, they sometimes must allow dissent from the most competent members, even if those members are dissenting from the highest authority. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian historians gained access to archives that confirmed what Western historians had already understood from interviews and declassified documents. Zhukov had indeed spoken against Stalin's offensive strategy. Zhukov had indeed insisted on defensive preparations. Zhukov's judgment had indeed proven correct. The historical record vindicated Zhukov completely. Zhukov's memoirs, finally published in full after the Soviet collapse, revealed a man who had been shaped by impossible circumstances. Zhukov had survived the Great Purge. Zhukov had served Hitler's invasion. Zhukov had fought Stalin's paranoia. Zhukov had understood that his value to the system was temporary. But during that temporary period of value, Zhukov had made decisions that shaped the course of history. The enduring significance of Zhukov is that he represents something all individuals face within larger systems: the question of when and how to speak truth to power. Zhukov did not attempt to overthrow Stalin. Zhukov did not attempt to create a democratic alternative. Zhukov simply insisted that his professional judgment was correct and that Stalin should listen. This was the minimal form of resistance, not revolution, not rebellion, simply insistence on being right about technical matters that fell within his domain. What Zhukov proved is that this minimal resistance is sometimes possible. It is not always possible. Many officers who disagreed with Stalin were executed. Many professionals who insisted on their expertise were killed. Zhukov was fortunate that his expertise mattered so much to Stalin that Stalin was willing to accept disagreement. But Zhukov was also wise enough to recognize that this tolerance for disagreement was conditional and temporary. After the war, after Zhukov's expertise was no longer essential to survival, both Stalin and Khrushchev removed him from power. Zhukov did not resist this removal. Zhukov accepted that his time of influence had ended. Zhukov lived quietly in exile. Zhukov did not attempt to build a power base or organize military resistance. Zhukov understood that the space he had occupied was a temporary space, created by specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the space closed. This understanding, that resistance to authority is sometimes possible but always temporary, that expertise creates a zone of autonomy that is conditional and limited, that individuals must know when to speak and when to accept silence, is perhaps Zhukov's deepest lesson. Zhukov was not a revolutionary, but Zhukov was also not simply a tool of the system. Zhukov was a man who understood his moment and used it. And then, when the moment passed, he accepted that his time had ended. The Soviet Union eventually understood the value of what Zhukov had done after the system itself had collapsed. After Zhukov was long dead, Russian historians and military theorists restored Zhukov to his rightful place as one of the great military figures of history. Streets were named after him. Statues were erected. His memoirs were published. His legacy was celebrated. But the most important legacy was not monuments. The most important legacy was the historical proof that even in a totalitarian system, there exists possibility for individual integrity. That one man, willing to risk his life, can influence events. That competence sometimes matters more than politics. That truth, when supported by expertise and courage, sometimes finds an audience, even among tyrants. Zhukov's life demonstrates that authoritarianism is not absolute, not because it becomes less authoritarian, but because even authoritarian systems need competence to survive. And sometimes, in that need for competence, space opens for individuals to insist on their judgment. Zhukov exploited that space. He paid a price for exploiting it, but in exploiting it, He possibly changed history.